In our last module, we looked at the importance of loving kindness and the essential role that it plays in living a life with integrity. We may have the best values and highest principles in the whole wide world, but if we're not decent people, what's the point? In this module, we're going to be looking at a quality that's equally important to loving kindness when it comes to integrity, and I'm referring to the quality of healthy self-respect. When we have healthy self-respect, we have the ability to set healthy boundaries. When we can set healthy boundaries, we're able to care for ourselves, and we're free to effectively care for those around us. It can be helpful here to think of our wisdom wheel of integrity like a system of checks and balances. Each council member is here to contribute to the overall balance of the whole. A strong moral code without loving kindness can manifest itself through a shadow of meanness. Similarly, loving kindness without healthy self-respect can manifest itself through the shadows of people-pleasing, self-sacrifice, and codependence. The majority of people who are drawn to the healing arts or various forms of social spiritual activism, or to a course like this one, I'm guessing, are kind-hearted, sensitive, and compassionate people. And if you're anything like me, you probably tend to feel best when things are harmonious, both outside of you and inside. But the thing is that life is rarely harmonious, and it's certainly not harmonious all of the time. When I was growing up, there was a lot of love in my family, but it was not harmonious, not by a long shot. We had lots of wonderful moments, but we also had a lot of challenging, painful dynamics that were anything but comfortable. So I learned very early on not only to be a peace seeker, but a peacemaker. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of you taking this course can relate. So, of course, if the world didn't have inner and outer peacemakers, we'd all be in deep trouble. We need peacemakers and agents of diplomacy and kindness to help us build bridges, get along, communicate better, understand and forgive each other, so that we can all live in as much harmony as possible. Still, loving kindness junkies like myself tend to run into problems when our deep desire for peace is driven by an even deeper fear of conflict, which is often hiding beneath an even deeper fear of anger. So in a book I wrote over 25 years ago that I recently republished, Walking a Fine Line, How to Be a Professional Wisdom Keeper in the Healing Arts, I wrote about how I used to think if I was just peaceful, loving, and kind enough, things would just work out. And boy, was I wrong. Although it is wonderful when being nice is enough to make something good happen in a relationship or in the world, being a good person isn't always enough. At some point, if we want to live in integrity, many of us loving kindness addicts have to face a tough but essential truth. Sometimes in life, even nice guys have to be bad guys, especially when being perceived as a bad guy is experienced as taboo. I found in my own life, if I continue to cling to my goodness, I can end up using harmony-loving philosophies to justify my own passivity. I can use it to justify an unwillingness to stand up for myself and my core values. Sometimes my fear of conflict makes me miss out on chances to stand up for other people who are in real need of my advocacy. Not just people, but our whole planet and all of its inhabitants. Many of us whose emotional or childhood survival strategies involved an over-identification with loving kindness end up choosing our goodness over our own well-being. We just can't stand the thought of somebody perceiving us as aggressive, selfish, stubborn, impolite, hurtful, overpowering, dominating, intimidating, pig-headed, irrational, rebellious. You get the idea. But unfortunately, when we stick with loving kindness at all costs, we risk abandoning our true nature, sitting on our authentic power, and biting our truth-telling tongues. In our deep desire to be good, or at least always be seen as good, we can actually end up doing a lot of bad. We can do plenty of bad to ourselves, putting ourselves in abusive, destructive, and disempowering situations and relationships. And even if it's the last thing we want, we can do some bad in the world too. It's not that we intentionally go out there and do bad things. It's more like we unintentionally let bad things happen because we're too afraid of what might happen if we stand up and insist on something else happening. Or we apply just a nice bandage here and there, but we don't really address the cause, the root cause of anyone's suffering. Again, when it comes to healthy self-respect, I'm not encouraging you or anybody to be mean and sensitive or heartless. I'm encouraging you to sometimes do what's required in order to be true to yourself. to take care of yourself, to be true to a virtue you hold dear, or to courageously address a collective need which is valid. As I'm sure you know, sometimes lobbyists have to be pushy in order to get a good law passed. And while many of our most impactful human rights movements did have roots in spirituality, where loving kindness and equality and compassion were deeply valued, most effective human rights movements didn't gain traction because protesters took to the streets with protest signs saying, "Please and thank you." So this wisdom keeper, this integrity council member, is here to remind us of the fact that sometimes very nice people have to be stubborn, determined, loud, annoying, confronting, boundaried, or frustrating in order to honor themselves and in order to get through to those around them so that they can manifest their essentially loving and kind ideals. It is in the spirit of balance that I now call upon the wisdom keeper, who will be sitting on the opposite side of loving kindness and who will make their home in the collective seat of healthy self-respect. So let's see who comes to us. The wisdom keeper I pulled on behalf of the collective, the wisdom keeper who shall be sitting in the seat of healthy self-respect over the coming days and weeks, is the wisdom keeper of resolve and divine will. This is such a good card for what we're exploring here. It speaks straight to the fact that the true revolution must begin within, from a place of deep inner relaxation, deep honoring, and an ability to set healthy boundaries. So let me start by sharing the story of this wisdom keeper with you, and then their gift to you. And after that, I'll share some reflections that came up for me in relation to this wisdom keeper, and some ways for you to explore your own response to the collective integrity themes inherent in this wisdom keeper story. As with the first wisdom keeper story, get comfortable, relax, and listen deeply with your heart. The 40th gift of resolve is about becoming adept at giving to yourself. Ultimately, it is about deep physical relaxation. The gift of resolve, the shadow of exhaustion, the city of divine will. I was born into a family with spiritual and artistic traditions that went back thousands of years. But as a boy, I was stolen from my parents and forced into slavery. My master had nothing but contempt for me. He saw and treated me like an animal. I survived by giving myself tirelessly, without complaint. When beaten for not working hard enough, I worked harder. Because of my obedience and unusual strength, I was given increasing amounts of responsibility, thus stress. Eventually, my stomach started to burn and my digestive system shut down. I got so sick and exhausted, my master no longer had use for me. He threw me out with nothing but the scars on my back. A young woman found me in the dirt. She was dark-skinned like me, but she was free. She gave me shelter, nursed me back to health, and found work for me. I didn't mind the low pay or invisibility. I acquiesced in my role willingly, grateful not to be beaten. For many years, I worked very hard. But I was lonely, broken, and deeply afraid of people. I only drew comfort from carving statues out of wood like the ones my grandfather made before I was taken away. One day the woman saw my carvings and was impressed. She encouraged me to set up shop for myself. I said no, but she was stubborn and intuitive. The next thing I knew, she purchased a small shop and hung up a sign with my name on the door. For the first time in my life, I was my own boss. This realization brought forth an ache so vast that I cried myself to sleep for a year. As I embraced my pain, I grew to love what I did. It was hard work, but it didn't feel like it. My shop thrived, my stomach healed, and my body grew young again. Eventually, I let the woman into my heart, and she became my wife. It took us 10 years to save up enough money to return to our homeland and start a new life. The moment my foot stepped on African soil, I looked up at the open sky, inhaled the sweet air, and my entire being relaxed. Then I heard the distant sounds of my people singing and drumming, waiting for us to join them. I looked into the eyes of my beloved and knew I was home. I come when it's time to relax and for you to understand the importance of balancing your desire to serve the world and your need to enjoy your life. Do not be afraid to stand your ground, set healthy boundaries, or be generous with yourself. Your time and energy are precious. Sometimes saying no to the right thing can be more powerful than saying yes. I'm not asking that you rest now and then. I want you to relax deeply and fully with your whole being. When you are genuinely relaxed, you're free to work in harmony with your true nature and environment, and will have all of the energy required to complete any task, no matter how great. The health of our communities and nations depend on people who have true inner resolve and a balanced physical, emotional, and spiritual life. There is so much I love about this wisdom keeper and his powerful story. While I can't possibly know the unimaginable suffering that he's experienced, having been stolen from his home, forced into slavery, and violently abused for much of his childhood and adult life, there's so much I've learned from him and continue to learn. And though our lives have obviously been very different, there's also a lot that I could relate to, and I'm guessing that you can too. For example, you and I may never have been enslaved, but that doesn't mean we don't know what it's like to feel powerless, or stripped of our dignity, or sense of personal agency. Perhaps there was a time in your life when you felt like you had no choice other than to obey orders, follow the rules, or get in line. Maybe you've had a parent, a boss, a teacher, a partner, or someone you were deeply dependent on who was intimidating, manipulative, abusive, or controlling in some way. Abuse can be subtle, but still extremely damaging. Maybe there have been times in your life when you've had to do work or take on jobs that you hated. Maybe you've had to sacrifice dream after dream just to pay the bills, and you couldn't see any other option for yourself. Maybe that's even happening right now. You may also be someone whose strengths, goodwill, talents, and abilities have landed you with way, way, way too much responsibility. Maybe you've learned that you can handle a whole lot of responsibility, but you still haven't learned that just because you can doesn't mean you have to. Or maybe you know that you don't have to carry so much responsibility, but you don't know how to stop. Or you don't feel like you have the right to say no. Or maybe you're terrified that if you do say no, everything's going to fall apart, or people are going to get angry, or someone else will have to take on the burden that you've been carrying, and you'd never be able to forgive yourself for leaving such a heavy burden with someone else. Or maybe you've become addicted to stress. Maybe you wouldn't even know what to do with yourself if you weren't busy all the time, if you weren't filling your hours and days with giving and overextending yourself. Maybe deep down you're afraid to be alone, or to be bored, or to be replaced, or to feel pain, or to feel lost, irrelevant, or utterly purposeless. And so you're willing to keep saying yes and yes and yes at the expense of your body, and at the expense of your health, and at the expense of your own healthy self-respect. You've become your own cruel taskmaster, not listening to your body's cries for help, or even if you do hear them, you constantly override them. Maybe, like this wisdom keeper, you've experienced your share of heartburn and digestive issues or deep exhaustion. Maybe you suffered from chronic fatigue, insomnia, hormonal imbalances, skin disturbances, back pain, or some other illness that feels somehow connected to a deep level of stress or burnout. If you're honest with yourself, you'll probably know which of your body's ailments or symptoms are at least partially related to burnout and stress, and an inability or unwillingness to slow down. Only you know how your personal story relates to the story of this particular wisdom keeper. However yours or mine does, what matters is that we hear and truly receive this main message for us. This wisdom keeper is telling us that it's not only okay to have a self, he's telling us that it's essential. Even if we're working for someone else, we still, in the end, need to be our own boss. Our own bodies will suffer if we don't. Our minds will suffer, our emotional systems will suffer, our spirit will suffer. In a very profound way, we are all being called home, just like this wisdom keeper. Our health depends on it. Our integrity depends on it. One extremely important thing that this wisdom keeper is also telling us is that healthy self-respect is deeply connected to self-care. that our inner resolve is intimately dependent on our ability and willingness to relax at a very, very deep level. He's not talking about sitting down and watching Netflix for 12 hours a day over the weekend, not that there isn't a time or place for good entertainment, but he's talking about something much, much more profound than that. The kind of relaxation that truly nourishes the soul. For the wisdom keeper of resolve and divine will, ultimately, truly relaxing meant claiming a part of his ancestral heritage, finding a way to drop into a deeply surrendered present state of being through the creative process. This part of the wisdom keeper's story reminds me of a client that I once had, one that I could really relate to. She was an extremely busy social worker, counselor, and activist. She worked in the heart of the inner city and was surrounded by so much suffering. She witnessed one heart-wrenching example of injustice after another. And after years of relentlessly serving others through her therapeutic work and social change activities, her body finally gave out. She became overwhelmed with pain and exhaustion. And together we explored possible ways for her to slow down and to nurture herself. But it wasn't easy. She had to work very hard on giving herself permission to not work so hard. And this was a woman who'd done many, many difficult things in her life. But slowing down was probably the hardest thing she'd ever have to do. There were so many layers of guilt and fear for her to work through as she considered being gentler with herself. She was afraid of betraying her clients and her colleagues. She was terrified of letting down her parents who'd always expected so much from her, and her extended family that had a whole, humanly impossible work ethic. She felt guilty about abandoning her deepest values. She worried that if she took care of herself, that would mean that she'd be retreating into a life of privilege, while others in the world who didn't have the option that she had would still be suffering so much. She wasn't sure how she'd ever forgive herself for that. But over time, she came to see and embrace her humanness. And she ended up having to face the fact that when she was this burned out, her overextending and self-sacrificing tendencies didn't do anybody any good. She couldn't inspire anyone when she was exhausted, bitter, in pain, and filled with resentment, which I can totally relate to. And though she wished that she could, and Lord knows she tried, there was no way for her to effectively and genuinely transmit love and respect to anyone when she had no clue about how to love and respect herself. Thankfully, just like this wisdom keeper of resolve and divine will, this woman eventually found ways to relax. And one of the activities that became one of her favorites was an activity that her great-grandmother had taught her when she was a little girl. Her family was Asian American, and although she had completely assimilated into modern life in the United States, her grandmother had taught her how to do Chinese calligraphy in her early years. She'd forgotten all about it until one day she found herself walking home from an art shop with a calligraphy set under her arm. The next thing you know, she and her nervous system were completely entranced by a slow, delicate, meditative arts practice that had been passed down through the generations right into her lap. A deeply healing process took place as her life came back into greater balance. So maybe you and I aren't meant to carve statues out of wood or move to Africa or practice Asian calligraphy, but maybe there's a place or a practice that's waiting to be discovered by us. Maybe there's a way for us to experience greater balance in our lives, and maybe a focus on healthy self-respect holds the key to that transformation. If I've learned anything over the years as a counselor and a recovering codependent, it's that true healing occurs when there is an energetic balance between the giver and the receiver. Each person involved in a healing, teaching, or philanthropic exchange must give or receive something very different. On the surface, it may very well look like one person is doing the giving and the other person is doing the receiving. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that the exchange leaves both parties feeling nourished and enlivened, not depleted and resentful. Resentment can be subtle. It can pop up when we least expect it. Even if we're good at convincing ourselves that we can survive on personal goodwill alone, in the end, when deep down we feel like we're giving more than we're receiving, we end up subtly sending out a martyr-like message, like, you owe me one. It's rare that people are empowered through a relationship that feels riddled with debt. So many of us who tend to value loving kindness and workaholism over healthy self-respect and self-care, end up chronically putting up with situations that at the end are not sustainable or good for anyone. It's so important that we learn that it's safe to have and express a self in our personal and working relationships. Being selfless and overly flexible can really sabotage our ability to genuinely connect with people and to see them and their needs accurately. I've also had many experiences myself where I've been confronted with the fact that a lot of my hard work and attempts at offering loving kindness to others wasn't received. It wasn't wanted or needed anywhere near as much as I thought it was or as much as I needed it to be. And that's the key right there. My loving kindness wasn't needed as much as I needed it to be. I'd like to take a little more time to explore that statement at the risk of being redundant, because this need to be needed is one of the main reasons why many of us who've struggled with codependency throughout our lives will have a very hard time fully receiving and respecting the gift of the wisdom keeper, this particular wisdom keeper. And it's also why we won't be able to fully embody healthy self-respect, which is absolutely integral to living a life of integrity. First of all, let me make it clear that I'm not talking about healthy manifestations of interdependency. We all need each other on this planet. Humans, animals, plants, insects, soil, sun, alike. We're all interconnected. And without a willingness or ability to depend and lean on each other and be depended upon, we'd all be in big trouble. What I'm talking about here is unhealthy levels of dependency, where we end up getting lost in self-sacrifice, people-pleasing, conflict avoidance, and overextension, and where our intimate relationships, social relationships, professional relationships, and our entire way of engaging with the world around us suffers because of our need to be needed, or of a fear of what will happen if we don't constantly meet the needs of the beings around us. In Walking a Fine Line, the book that I wrote, I talk about how many professional wisdom keepers, whether they're therapists, healers, urban shamans, priestess circle holders, tarot card readers, or yoga teachers, how many of them easily fall into the martyr trap. The same goes for people who are committed to social and planetary change. In my own life, I've had phases where social sacred activism has played a particularly big role. Over the past few years, in addition to my work as a counselor, writer, teacher, and artist, and my life as a mom, friend, and community member, I found myself becoming increasingly engaged in social issues, both in my own country and abroad. My increased involvement with the Ugandan Human Rights Organization at a time when the humanity-loving work of my Ugandan colleagues put their lives in great danger has been especially challenging for me. It has forced me to take a good hard look at the often cruel and unjust limitations of the world that we're living in, and at my own utterly human limitations. It's also forced me to deal with deep personal wounds that stem from my own past. Because of the violent and hostile climate of Uganda towards my dear friends and colleagues, who are basically people who work tirelessly to serve, love, and protect the rights and lives of marginalized people, I found myself living in a constant state of fear that something horrible would happen to these friends of mine, people for whom I have so much love and respect. And because of my personal history, I've always tended to carry an over-exaggerated sense of responsibility for the people around me. But this time, I really believed that if I didn't do absolutely everything in my power to ensure that they had the support and security that they needed to survive this threatening and frightening time, that they could be arrested, even executed by a hostile government, or abused by the police, or brutally murdered in the streets. And even though my rational mind knew that there was only so much I could do, that I've absolutely no background expertise in the realms of politics or global activism, and that, we were up against the horrific and historical results of generations of colonialism and deep-seated and institutional forms of discrimination, and a government system full of corruption, this time saying no or setting a healthy limit did not feel like an option. And even if my efforts didn't bring about lasting or effective change, a decision to put a boundary around what I could or would do felt unforgivable. No matter what toll the situation took on my physical or emotional health or on my family's financial and relational well-being, setting limits or practicing self-care did not feel like an option for me. I just was not able to turn away, and I didn't know how to stay open-eyed, open-hearted, and say no at the same time. One thing that made it feel especially impossible to set limits was that setting healthy limits or practicing self-care didn't feel like an option for my colleagues in Uganda either. If they didn't do everything they possibly could do to deal with the situation, they wouldn't only be putting their own lives at risk, but the lives of the countless people that they were serving and felt responsible for. So they gave every ounce of themselves in an attempt to save lives and to change the attitudes of leaders who are attempting to legalize persecution and violence against marginalized people. And in order to do their work and to meet an exponentially growing amount of needs, they turned to me and others here in the States to support their efforts. How could I possibly say no? What they were to experience was 1,000,000 times worse than anything that I could possibly imagine. The bravery, stamina, selflessness that I witnessed in them was beyond inspiring. But the truth and the problem was that while our circumstances were different, all of us were being stretched beyond our energetic, financial, and emotional capacity. We had all become well-intentioned yet exhausted victims of a hopeless, unjust, and bigger than any of us situation. We were cogs in an endless wheel of suffering and unmet needs. And so for quite some time, none of us were willing to be the ones to say, you know what, I can do this, but I just can't do that. Someone else is going to have to step in and take that one on. And if no one does, then I'm going to have to tolerate the pain of knowing that so much of the situation is beyond my control, and that sometimes on planet Earth, horrific things happen to really, really good people. I tell you, there is something about trying to solve problems in the third world countries that can really humble a person. Things got to a point where sacred activism had basically taken over my life. I had no boundaries. Self-care had been banned from my vocabulary. My health, relationships, and ability to focus on my own life's work became so compromised that I couldn't any longer ignore it. I noticed that I wasn't just having trouble setting limits around what I could do in relation to Uganda. I was having trouble setting limits everywhere. I was walking on a field of eggshells, and all of the hard work I'd done in my life to heal unhealthy codependency tendencies had flown right out the window. And as much as I like to think of myself as a kind and loving person, I was starting to resent it big time, because I looked around and noticed plenty of other people saying no, exercising their bodies, reading good books, prioritizing their work, exploring their passions, taking vacations. Some people who were close to me didn't seem to have a problem saying no to me during my moments of intense need, or making sure that they had the time and space that they needed to take care of their own needs. And I also noticed that some of the people I was working so hard to hear and whose needs I was working so hard to honor so that our work in Uganda could be effective weren't necessarily seeing, appreciating, or making use of my hard-labored contributions either. Some of what I was doing was helpful, but some of it, for many reasons, just plain wasn't. And the fact that a good chunk of my hard work wasn't actually being recognized, received, or experienced as effective was extremely important for me to face. Talk about a hard pill to swallow. It was noticing my overall ineffectiveness, as well as the stark and brutal contrast between what I was willing to do for others and what I was willing to do for myself, that provided me with a big wake-up call. I needed to take a deep breath and return to my own healing process. I needed to take a hard look at some of the painful childhood patterns and survival strategies that were being activated by this difficult situation. If I truly wanted to be of service in this world, if I wanted to truly be present, I had to deal with those childhood wounds that left me feeling so willing and in a hurry to abandon myself in order to be there for others. The inner child in me was calling out for my loving kindness. This was the child who'd learned from birth that the only way to secure her own safety and protection was by meeting the needs of the people around her, by making sure that nothing and no one fell apart. If she could just make sure that her parents, sister, family, community, the world were physically, emotionally, and spiritually safe, then maybe, just maybe, they'd be stable and surplused enough to take care of her. This inner child had lost all trust in other people. She'd also lost trust in the universe itself. And when you don't trust people and when you don't trust the universe, there is no such thing as recognizing and surrendering to divine will. Of course, the situation in Uganda and other equally cruel and horrible situations happening all over the world, even right in our own backyard, are very, very real. People all over our world are suffering. They are being victims of real tragedies, both human and nature-made. So I'm not saying that difficult situations like the one I'm describing are just opportunities for privileged wisdom seekers to heal our codependency wounds, or that surrendering to divine will means you passively sit by and watch horrible things happen to good people. I'm not saying that. Painful situations are also wonderful opportunities for all of us to wake up, join the planetary family, and get involved. These are opportunities for us to discover that much of the time, when we surrender our personal will to something much greater than ourselves, we end up just naturally, authentically, healthfully doing a lot of good. But if we don't take an honest look at where we're coming from when attempting to make the world a better place, we may end up unconsciously or unintentionally making the world a worse place. In the name of empathy, sympathy, and generosity, we end up adding stress, suffering, and martyrdom to the human soup, and that's not good for anybody. So slowly but surely, I'm learning that during these moments, when my personal will is aligned with divine will, my generous, loving acts feel nourishing to me and they don't feel draining. They feel authentic, not forced. I feel called by love, not guilt, obligation, or fear. My contributions are full of creativity, not drudgery. This doesn't mean I'm not working hard or facing challenges or acknowledging my very real limitations, but it feels different in my bones, in my heart. Just like the wisdom keeper of resolve in divine will says, it was hard work, but it didn't feel like it.